Welcome to the OC24 podcast, where we've taken some of the best talks and discussions from this year's 24-hour conference on global organised crime, which showcases some of the most interesting research into organised crime around the world. This episode is called The Politics of Violence in Mexico and Central America.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon from wherever you are joining us today. My name is Cecilia Farfán. I work at the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And today I have the great pleasure of moderating a conversation on the politics of violence in Mexico and Central America. Just a reminder to everyone who's joining our session, this is a catwalk session. So the idea is for our presenters to speak for 5 minutes about on the research and any results and why they matter, and then have a lot of interaction with you. So you're highly encouraged to submit your questions via the Q&A button. You can also use the chat, but it would help us more if you use the Q&A. So the idea is, as I mentioned, for this to be very interactive, to have this conversation. Before we start, on behalf of the other panelists, we do want to express our solidarity to Dr. Sandra Ley, whose institution in Mexico right now is facing some very difficult challenges from the government. And so if you would like to sign a petition supporting CIDE and supporting her institution, we're going to share that link in the chat. So please feel free to sign and share as widely as possible. This is a critical time in Mexican academia. So now that I mentioned that, let me start with Romain, who will speak on Mexico. We'll go Mexico, Central America, Mexico, Central America. And again, highly encouraged to submit your questions. I'll be moderating. And Romain, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you for having me. Being here with Gema, Sandra, you, and Markus. I'm Romain. I'm the founder of the independent research center called Noria Research, and I'm currently program officer at Mexico Evalúa in Mexico City, working on public security and violence reduction. What I will present today is the product of research and field work conducted in Mexico, particularly in the states of Michoacán and Guerrero since 2013, and the product of research and analysis in the country in general, trying to better analyze a couple of central questions that I think will animate us today. It's like, how can we better understand the relations between public authorities and criminal or violent groups in Mexico? How can we move away from the refrain of narco stories, state weakness, failure, capture, and all that? How can we actually analyze state power as it actually works in reality and not how we want it to function in theory? And given say that, of course, how can we explain the levels and practices of violence that we witness in Mexico, both in the hands of criminal groups and public armed forces? We're talking about more than 300,000 dead in 15 years, more than 100,000 disappeared, daily shootings, torture, mass graves, and massacres. So basically, how can we better document and understand the relations between the state and criminal groups without falling into the idea of a zero-sum game where, in order to thrive, one actor should annihilate the other? I think the first idea must be said clearly. Those relationships are not a zero-sum game. It does not work like that in reality. Political criminal relationships are fluid, involving continual interactions between multiple private and public actors. And those interactions are unstable and sometimes violent, but they do not necessarily indicate the capture, weakening, or failure of the state. Rather, I think what we see is overlapping sovereignties that collaborate and compete in a given territory. The first idea I'd like to bring to the table and for the questions and dialogue, of course, is the stability of the political system in Mexico. In Mexico, actually, private criminal or violent groups do not seek to overthrow the political system, but rather to gain or maintain an advantageous position within it. And to support this argument, I have 4 ideas, basically. Like, first, the classic theory about state monopoly on the legitimate use of force falls very short in explaining what's at stake in Mexico. In fact, I think it's important to understand and acknowledge not only that the state does not seek to monopolize violence, but that it never really did, actually, and that it does not impede its formation process and actual power. Second, that we have violent social orders. It might seem paradoxical, but order does not necessarily imply the absence of violence, but rather the regulation of its use by multiple actors. So in this case, the word order that we read a lot can be understood, I think, as the collection of rules that govern the use of violence and the modalities of power and authority, particularly at the very local level. Third, public authorities are not passive bystanders in the operation of violent social orders. They're both participants and arbitrator, setting the rules and the terms of violence. In the Mexican context, there is no shortage of historical examples of this. And fourth, the power of the state is neither perfect nor absolute across time and space. It does not imply a normative conclusion about the quality of its power, contrary to what we read about weak democracy, failed state, and all that. Actually, violent order does not lead to the collapse of the state, but instead a redefinition of its role in regulating the use of violence relative to a multitude of actors. So if we accept these four propositions, I think what we observe on the ground are local complex political conflicts that involve violence. Then it's essential to abandon the idea that political criminal relationships are based on processes of absolute clear-cut dominations. The interactions are unstable, and the lord of today is the serf of tomorrow. So what we see is networks of interdependence marked by collaboration, instability, and conflict. So basically what you see on the ground is multiple actors interacting in a quite disordered day-to-day way. Something important, of course, is what's the use of violence in all this. I think in Mexico, unfortunately, violence, be it legitimate or not, be it in the hands of the state or criminal groups, does not represent an anomaly, an obstacle, something that should disappear. Unfortunately, violence is a political resource. It's a tool that allows multiple actors to establish or preserve a position of power relative to competitors and unstable relations. In this sense, there is a continual back and forth in the relationship between state authorities and criminals without having total control of one actor over the interactions. The result, of course, is that the categories of good and bad, legitimate and illegitimate, legal and illegal are fuzzy and fluid, and we should understand them and research them that way. Many times the narco or the criminal, the violent actor, to use a more neutral term, is also a cacique, a boss, a political leader, a police official, a member of the military, a governor, a mayor, a council person, a businessman, among many others. Therefore, rather than seeking to impose normative or moral categories, I think we should analyze the constant changes in alliances and hierarchies to understand how power is designed and held in those territories that, despite what is often said, have not been abandoned by the state. Nevertheless, I think the trap, of course, is to conceptualize the power of those local bosses or sovereigns in opposition to public authorities and not in articulation with them. What I observe in Mexico is that hundreds of local bosses or sovereigns evolve in the same territory, forming kind of layers of sovereignty that overlap, and where the presence of one violent actor does not imply the disappearance of the other. Again, this is the case, that we see in municipalities where avocado is produced in Michoacán, for example. This is what happened during the autodefensas militias in Michoacán as well, where you have de facto sovereigns that build their power within the national borders in collaboration, in spite, and against the state. So they represent ephemeral projects of sovereignty and power constantly threatened by other actors and competitors, which include public authorities or forces. So the last question is, where is the state in all that? Well, I think in Mexico, the state is everywhere. In the Mexican context, I believe that the crises we observe do not arise from the absence of the state or the presence of informal bosses at the local level. They have always been present. I think the crises come from the ever-growing centrality of violence as a resource and a political tool to actually access local power, both for public and private actors. Therefore, conflicts are resolved through exerting lethal and non-lethal forms of violence that are ever more extreme, including those perpetrated by security forces. The objective here is not only to obtain a better position within the political game, it's actually to obtain maximum domination, often through the annihilation of adversary and their supporters. Yet, coming back to the idea of non-monopolization of violence by the state, the role of public authorities and institutions. Yeah, I'm finishing.
Thank you.
The role of authorities in these processes is multiple and sometimes counterintuitive. I think what authorities actually seek is reliable intermediaries, brokers, and allies at the local level, even if they are violent or criminal actors. That's what we see when the state actually negotiates with local violent actors. An example of governance through violent private groups. In this configuration, and I will conclude with that, the state does not seek to impose itself as a unique sovereign, but I think to reorganize local violent brokers to its benefit, even if it implies giving political space to illegal violent groups. And by extension, I think the policy solutions that we were trying to imagine to provide, again, a solution to what's going on in Mexico will remain unattainable in the absence of careful local research and local knowledge on what's going on at the very local level. And I think it's urgent that we do so. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Romain. Gema, the floor is yours. You're, of course, a scholar of Mexico, but also of Central America. So we're very interested in your take on these two regions or two areas.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cecilia. I'm very happy to be here. And so my name is Gema Kloppe-Santamaría. I'm an assistant professor of Latin American history at Loyola University Chicago. And at the moment, I'm a Marie Curie Fellow at the Freiburg Institute of Advanced Study at the University of Freiburg. So it's really a pleasure to be in conversation with colleagues, which work I admire so much. And many of the things I'm going to say actually echo a lot of what Romain just mentioned. And these are a few general ideas that I can discuss further in the Q&A with more historically grounded and empirical examples. But this is based basically on my past and ongoing research on gangs and security responses in Northern Central America, as well as on my work on lynchings in modern and contemporary Mexico. And my main goal here is to question a narrative that implicitly or implicitly characterizes criminal violence in these countries as non-political or post-political. That is to say, a form of violence mainly driven by economic interest and that can be contrasted with the political violence of these regions' quote-unquote past, perpetrated either by state actors, guerrillas, or paramilitary forces based on political interest. Now, before discussing why I believe this characterization of criminal violence is wrong, let me quickly say that this narrative is not entirely groundless. In the 1980s and 1990s, these countries experienced a transition from military or highly undemocratic governments to electoral and liberal democratic regimes. These so-called democratic turns signal, at least in principle, the demilitarization of police forces and the desanctioning of the criminalization and repression of political forms of dissent. While far from perfect, these transitions fed into a linear narrative that claims that we went from the violence exercised primarily by repressive governments to a violence committed by gangs, drug traffickers, and other quote-unquote petite criminals with no political motivations and with allegedly no relation to state forces. Hence, in this narrative, the violence we witness today is not primarily that of the state against its citizens, or that is what the narrative says, but that of so-called criminals against citizens. And the state only is seen here as intervening to protect law-abiding citizens from these so-called criminals. In the interest of time, I'll just briefly list 4 reasons as to why I believe this characterization of criminal violence as non-political is wrong. So first, it has become increasingly clear that transitions to democracy did not bring about the type of police reform and demilitarization that was much expected. In Mexico and Northern Central America, repressive forms of policing are driven by political interest. In particular, they are driven by political elites' interest of securing more votes through the use of mano dura or hard fist hand policies, militarized responses, and even extrajudicial measures. Second, while much literature claims that criminal violence emerges in places where the state is absent, it has become increasingly clear that the state is present in the communities where these forms of violence exist, but it's present in irregular and reactive ways. That is to say, while the state tends to be absent in the sense of the steady provision of public goods and services, it tends to be excessively present when it comes to militarized, repressive, and short-term interventions that seek to make a show of force against so-called criminal actors. Third, as recent literature suggests, there are strong connections between state actors and criminal groups, and we can talk about examples, but I'll just mention that in Mexico's recent past, lynchings involve the participation of majors and police officers in the organization. Even today, where there is not such an overt participation in the organization of lynchings, the police is oftentimes present, but is simply incapable or unwilling to protect suspected criminals. Although cases where the police is outnumbered by lynch mobs could suggest that the problem is one of state absence, this absence needs to be qualified. It is a selective absence, referring to lack of public services or of citizen-based forms of policing properly trained and equipped, but that it is often combined with the reactive presence of state and federal police officers or of the military at times when the state wants to assert its authority. Lastly, my 4th point is evidence suggests that these so-called criminal actors are political. If we go beyond an understanding of the political, centered on electoral processes, and we look at how they participate in the creation of political and social orders, no? So exactly like what Romain was mentioning. In the case of lynching, perpetrators are, through their threats and actions, defining the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Just like state actors, they exercise a form of social control that divides citizens between law-abiding and criminal others. They act then like proxy states or semi-sovereigns that reproduce rather than defy the state's partiality, violence, and injustice. And again, we can talk more about this with empirical cases or historical cases in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Gema. Sandra?
Thank you, and thanks for the solidarity, everyone, in this troubled time. Sorry for my technical problems, but I think we're all set. So I'm probably going to be changing a little bit the discussion towards of course, about criminal violence, but also thinking about what is the role of civil society, and I think that touches upon Gema's research too, and part of what she has just discussed. So for me, something that I'm interested now in assessing and going deeper into is criminal governance in a particular part of the controls that it exerts. We know that when we have been talking about criminal governance, we refer to 3 different types of controls: political, economic, and social. And we know that through violent and non-violent means, organized crime imposes de facto controls in these 3 different areas. It has become very clear in the case of Mexico, the way in which these political controls have been exerted, particularly in the most recent election, which Cecilia and Romain have been working very thoroughly understanding the role of those political controls, among other types of violence that are present. But criminal strategies to control civil society have not been systematically analyzed yet. we know even less about the subsequent capacity of civil society groups to collectively organize in response to violence. And so my current project addresses two intertwined questions. Why does organized crime target civil society, and under what conditions can civil society organizations confront and resist criminal governance? To understand this, I believe that we have first, of course, to disaggregate what organized crime means and seeks, right? As Romain and Gema were saying, organized crime is enabled by these protection networks through which state and criminal actors collude. In the absence of such protection, information gathering becomes crucial for success in the criminal world. And this is something that classical works by Gambetta and Varese have shown. And this is where the social aspect of criminal governance comes in, I believe. Residents in local communities are particularly valuable for the establishment of local protection and the control of information channels. So some groups of residents, however, can be more or less valuable for protection and informational purposes. They may have fine-grained information about what happens in their communities and their surroundings. They have the capacity to report such activity. They can open or close valuable sources, informational channels about that will be available for any criminal organization seeking to establish control. So therefore, organized crime is interested in regulating civilian behavior to control what people can say, what people can do, limit what state authorities can discover about criminal activity, reduce police attention, and ultimately deepen protection networks. But something that I believe we need to understand and disaggregate a little bit further is that civil society in these communities is diverse, right? And some groups of residents may be more or less valuable for organized crime and for informational purposes. We have human rights activists, we have journalists, we have churches and religious leaders, we have the private sector and business leaders. And we know, for example, that religious leaders might have access to information, but most importantly, they may have the ability to influence some behavior. We have human rights activists and journalists that are crucial elements for informational channels. Business leaders might have a more direct channel with policymakers to lobby in favor of certain policies. And they may be, therefore, more valuable for how protection networks reconfigure. So we need to think more about how are these different groups within civil society valuable, and how do they insert within this logic of of the social controls of criminal governance. Overall, I argue that to understand the relationship between organized crime and civil society, as well as the social controls that criminal groups may seek to impose, we must first acknowledge these forms of civil society, from human rights organizations to media, churches, and private businesses, as well as the various purposes that civil society organizations can cover. So I further contend that this nature and activity of each group is likely to be valuable for organized crime groups for different reasons and in distinct ways to maximize protection and information. And consequently, this interaction between organized crime and the diverse set of organizations that compose civil society is likely to differ from one group to another. And overall, perhaps what an argument I make here is that the greater leverage that a given organization has and its members to affect organized crime protection and information gathering strategies, the higher the violence that these groups are likely to face. So far, we have evidence that of different ways in which these different groups have organized, sometimes through protests against insecurity, sometimes through a direct channel with policymakers, sometimes through their own armed strategies. And so that is something that I'm seeking to understand now as a way to explain how civil society in the midst of violence can resist and become part of the dynamic of organized crime in the Mexican case. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Markus, please, floor is yours to close this first round of comments.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Romain and Cecilia, for the invitation to this session. My name is Markus. I'm a researcher at the Global Security Program at the Pembroke College in Oxford. I will now look into crime and policing, but from the angle of security governance reform in Guatemala. In 2021, Guatemala has been classified by the Global Organized Crime Index as a high criminality, low resilience country, and it ranks 23rd, just a bit below Brazil. The 2021 index is quite interesting in this regard, also what we're discussing in this panel, as it not only focuses on state authorities and their relation to crime in the sense of that states, if they are quite strong, they can actually be resilient to crime, but the authors of the index also show that the state's monopoly of violence, while it can increase this resilience, is quite flawed as long as criminal actors are embedded in the state apparatus, which, according to the index, represents the most prevalent type actually of criminal actors worldwide. So state security actors like the police can be drivers of criminal activities, which may be contrary to some of the idealized perceptions we may have on law enforcement. So the boundaries between the state and organized crime are porous in Guatemala, as you all know, while the UN-sponsored International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CIDE, has been quite successful in breaking up some of these corruption networks and so-called illegal clandestine security apparatuses that have been operating in the country since the civil war that ended in 1996. The old corrupt guard actually has prevailed. The so-called Pacto de Corruptos operating from the Guatemalan Congress has achieved that the CIDE mandate has not been renewed in 2019. And also there's increased pressure on anti-corruption attorneys most recently. So in general, perception in Guatemala is, according to America's Barometer, that people think 68% of citizens think that their country is corrupt, and trust in state institutions quite low, including in the police, as only 31% of Guatemalans actually trust their force that has been founded in the year after the end of the war. So this last month alone, it's November 2021, we see a lot of examples that illustrate the deep-rooted problems of Guatemalan policing. To name just two. First, the Guatemalan National Civil Police have engaged in violent oppression of indigenous communities, protests against nickel mining projects in the region of Izabal. And second, the Narcotics Division of the Public Prosecutor's Office of Guatemala has recently ordered the detention of 19 police agents allegedly forming part of a micro-trafficking network that pushes drugs in Guatemala City. So these two examples speak to broader patterns of violent protection of private capital on the one side, and also to the blurred lines between crime and the law in Guatemala. And it comes a bit as a surprise because there's not a lot of countries around the world that have such a long history of internationally sponsored police, post-conflict police reform, and Gema has hinted to that already. Only in this year, the Justice Sector Reform Commission of the Guatemalan Congress has announced yet another new plan for a new police law. As the news outlet República has reported, the congressmen and women, however, did not really specify the reform project, but stated that it was, quote, urgent to resume democratic security in the country, unquote. What democratic security would mean has always been quite contested in post-conflict Guatemala, and my research on 25 years of security governance there, reform there that I've done during my doctoral studies has demonstrated why. I approached the reform process more in a sociological sense as a transnational social field, a field that has developed own rules, a diverse range of actors, national and international, competing over central strategic positions in the reform process and of authority over the reform process. So what I found in this field is quite, it has become a quite solid, relatively autonomous one that reproduces despite ongoing limitations and failures of reform process. So while the field is divided into an orthodox and a more heterodox pole, meaning that the former is more oriented to like iron fist policing, law and order, and the latter more towards softer citizen security approaches. What they have in common is a vested interest of keeping this reform process coming. So politicians, bureaucrats, and experts from all across the world actually fight over the control of this field and reproduce by that the limited reform process. As failure for some reformers actually always brings opportunities for others. So my research has at least three implications that are relevant to understanding the politics of violence and crime as we discuss it here. First, professionalization of state authorities alone will not be enough to improve policing and security provision in a country as long as the underlying rationales of security, which are informed of national security thinking, counterinsurgency perspective of a new internal enemy, not the guerrillero anymore, now it's a criminal insurgent, are not replaced with a perspective more on human or people-centered security. And as long as predatory informal rules, as Rachel Schwartz, I think, has called it recently, exist, which can hardly be fought by institutional reforms. And the second, my research also suggests that transformative potentials of international experts are quite overestimated. Not only have orthodox and law and order actors of the reform field been able to appropriate and reinterpret new reform approaches, and one example, for instance, is crime prevention, that looks quite progressive, but has often reproduced authoritarian patterns of making of public space, who is included, who is excluded, etc. Happy to talk about it in more detail later. But it's also not only local resistance that reproduces these negative consequences. It's also an overly idealized and ahistorical view on security approaches, such as community policing, crime prevention, community resilience, which are often inherently flawed in and of themselves. And third and final point, the overly technical focus of the security reform process is a major problem. The reformers search for a way to provide better expertise, more rational and effective reform approaches, has ignored the deep-seating political dimensions of police reform and the blurred lines between the state and criminal and corrupt interests, as they had been mentioned before. In this depoliticized context, the ineffective and illegitimate and at times also violent status quo of policing in Guatemala could reproduce as political interests and criminal practices have actually outlasted all these reform practices. So therefore, and with that I want to conclude, it's crucial not only to bring politics into the reform debate, but also open the field of reform for those historically marginalized within this reform field, but also by the state in more general. Only once structural questions such as deep-seating inequalities are addressed, and once the reform of the security sector is actually embedded into a way broader state reform process, I think meaningful change will only then be possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus, and thank you everyone for staying within the time. Just a reminder for everyone who joined us later, this is a catwalk session, meaning that you are highly encouraged to submit your questions via the Q&A button or the chat. The purpose of this session is to be very interactive and really have a conversation with our panelists. You know them from Twitter. Today is your opportunity to really talk with them. So we have a couple of questions already. So one is for Gema, but I believe all of you could answer, which talks about the conditions that allow the transition of criminal organizations for political actors to post-political actors and why this transition takes place. The other one is related to femicide and what part do the governments or criminal organizations play in committing these crimes, if any, and why? And so, who are the actors behind this killing? So if you like, we can start with these two questions and we can go now in the reverse order. If Markus, you would like to start with this and we'll go from there.
I think I will quickly pass on to Gema as the question was for her, the first one. So, let me think a bit about the other question.
Sure. If anyone wants to, again, join in the question that was addressed to Gema, please feel free to jump in.
Thank you. So yeah, this allows me to elaborate a little bit on my argument. So basically, what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to call into question this notion that what we see today is some sort of post-political violence, and in the sense that it's posterior to or after the political violence that these countries experienced prior to the 1980s and 1990s democratic transitions. This level of post-political assumes on the one hand that state responses to crime are devoid of politics, as if they were not driven by political interest. And as I said before, they are clearly driven by political interest, even if we understand political in the narrow sense of the word. I mean, they are seeking to attract votes from citizens that we know, based on surveys and more qualitative evidence, that citizens support. I mean, citizens strongly support mano dura policies in Northern Triangle of Central America, in Mexico. Citizens support also militarized interventions, despite the fact that we have plenty of evidence that these approaches have utterly failed, that what we need are citizen or human security approaches, but unfortunately, this is what sells in the ballot box. No? I mean, so clearly, politicians from left and right, I mean, we need to go beyond these left and right narratives. That doesn't allow us to grasp what is happening in this region. What is happening is more in line with this concept of populist, of punitive populism. No, I mean, where punitivism is really attractive in electoral terms. And then the other part of the equation that I want to criticize or call into question is that this post-political label assumes that these criminal actors do not have a political agenda, no, or that they are not political. And again, I mean, as Romain was saying too, right? I mean, and Sandra's work and her recent book with Guillermo Trejo also show this, no? I mean, these groups create criminal forms of governance. I mean, they create forms of social order, and even the lynch mobs that I have analyzed historically and in the present that are usually considered as this kind of like irrational and spontaneous mobs, they are creating a social order. I mean, they are acting as actors that want to establish social control and a form of sovereignty, if we understand sovereignty as he or she who decides who is going to die and who is going to live in a certain community. No? So those are the main points I wanted to make. And in relation to femicides, if I could just say, there is much research that needs to be done in this area in terms of tracing the responsibility of criminal and also state actors. But I would just say that in the region, the state's responsibility, we see it at least in two ways. On the one hand, clearly it's a question of impunity and negligence. And that is why historically the term, not only in this region, but in Latin America at large, implies the intentional killing of women because they are women, but it's also associated to this state impunity and the very harmful abandonment or lack of action in regards of these crimes. But also we see the active participation of police officers in these killings, no? in femicides, as well as in sexual violence. And we still have to, we need like more systematic data, but we also now know that the war on drugs, and this came in a report already from a few years ago, the war on drugs in the Northern Triangle of Central America and in Mexico has considerably increased the vulnerability of women. So militarized responses, we know, we have evidence, have increased the vulnerability of women, both to sexual violence and to femicides. No? And then the last thing I would say is in regards to criminal groups, what we know so far is that it's very much related to organized criminal groups that are dedicated to human trafficking and to sexual trafficking, no? And that these networks operate in a way where they might combine the use of family ties or sentimental ties, where women are, the word in Spanish is enganchadas. I mean, they are brought in from traditional family networks, of community networks, and then they are trafficked in order to be sold or exploited sexually, and that also can lead to femicides.
Sandra, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to add on the second question on femicides, because I think that just in case the audience might be interested, from the work by Estefanía Vela and Laura Tuesta from CIDE, PPD, and Intersecta, they have a really interesting and important report on this point that Gema was saying on militarization and the effect that it has had on rising violence against women, on how they are victims of the militarization strategies, right, and the way that police armed forces are being used on the ground. And at the same time, point the audience to the work by Abby Cordova, who has amazing new research on how police structures matters a lot for how violence against women plays out, showing how the Brazilian police was reformed actually had an impact in containing violence against women on the one hand, and on the other hand, showing how as criminal groups expand their territorial control, they also expand the use of sexual violence, and that actually has even further consequences in terms of their participation and engagement in their political and social lives in their community. So this has, let's say, like an amplification of violence. It's not only about the violence that they're facing outside their houses, they're facing it in their houses because now they have to stay at home and they're even more vulnerable. So, to the question, it's not only about the aggressors that they face at home or the aggressors that they face outside. It's actually both attacks happening at the same time because violence are becoming overlapping, right? And it's hard now to disentangle this.
Thank you, Sandra. Markus or Romain, whoever wants to.
Yeah,
Markus?
I mean, a bit connected to the question that Gema has already answered on the political dimension, also a new one that came in here for Romain, actually, but quickly saying a few words on it. About organization of negotiations with organized crime, or if this would be a way to address the short-term issues of violence. And I think, yeah, it was mentioned the case of San Salvador, but that case also showed how a gang can actually constitute as a more powerful political actor. I mean, we have seen that in gang studies for a long time, right, that the prison can actually act as a certain driver of organization of these kind of groups. And I think the truth in San Salvador for 2014 has actually showed that they then, after that, have gained significant political power, and that might be an unintended consequence. Even though violence can go back, in the long term, they might have a stronger position to negotiate with state authorities. That's just one point I wanted to quickly mention, but I'm sure Romain has more to say about that in Mexican context.
Thank you, Markus. Just to go back really quickly on what Gema was saying about what we consider being political or non-political. I think it's extremely important. I think her work actually shows that in the Mexican case, we still follow this idea that we had, a peaceful authoritarian past that then transition to a chaotic democratic regime somehow. And what Gema's work and what historians have very, very, very successfully shown in the past years in Mexico and abroad is that basically this idea of a rupture between a peaceful past and a violent present is absolutely not true. I mean, so what we are trying to disentangle here is actually what has changed probably in the regulation of violence, what is tolerated and what it's not. What are the new actors, private and public, interested in using violence to achieve political, economic, social goals, right? And I think that's where the conversation between Mexico and Central America should happen much more, actually, like that we should be exchanging and dialoguing much more to try to understand questions like the truth in San Salvador between criminal groups and the state. Like there's so many ideas of negotiations and justice and what's going on in Mexico and how could you pacify Mexico that actually rely on the idea that you have in front of you rational actors, public or private, criminal or state, that actually want to make violence disappear. Like it's a goal. It's unfortunate, but I think it's not like that, actually. Like no one, unfortunately, in those areas today are fundamentally interested in making violence disappear because, again, like I think violence is a very central political resource. So when violence is such a political resource, and when violence is so functional in the political system, how can you actually make it disappear? And in that case, of course, you could probably negotiate, and I would love to see it happen somehow, but I would also love to see violence reducing in Mexico, of course. But I think how can you extract and how can you change the role that violence plays in the political system is the huge question that we're facing. And again, that's where I think Central America has a lot to tell to Mexico and vice versa, and that we should be probably talking about it much more, actually.
Thank you, Romain. Our colleague Anna Sergi poses a very interesting question, and she is separating exercising power compared to exercising violence. And so, of course, you can use one to activate the other. And so she's asking, you to comment, if you have from your own research, this separation of, power and violence and how you think about that in the context in which you research. So anyone who wants to jump in, feel free.
Yeah, I'll be very short to let everyone participate. I think it's a very good question that actually goes towards, again, trying to analyze the relationship between public authorities and private groups, right? So when we say that the state is actually present and the state is actually capable of exerting power, it's capable of doing it through violence, but also through other means. And it's also true for private actors, actually. Like, I think we tend, especially in the Mexican case, honestly, to follow spectacular violence and to pretend or to associate spectacular violence, like narco stuff, basically, to power, and just like absorb criminal groups' propaganda, for example, and the more violent and spectacularly violent they are, the more we associate it with power, like violence means power. And actually, when you get to the ground, you do realize that there are so many different actors that actually exert power without being spectacularly violent. And that's what Gema was saying about political elites, for example. And that's, again, what's counterintuitive and unfortunate about what's going on in Mexico, is that at the local level, many times, unfortunately, political elites are very powerful, but they're not against the use of violence to achieve more power. Actually, they fuel violence in many ways, in more discreet ways, probably, that, narco videos that are extremely sexy and attractive for everybody, but that probably hide what's really at stake in terms of control and power. And in that sense, and again, Gema has worked on this much more than me, like, power might be very discreet, but I think it didn't really change in structural terms in Mexico in the past years, basically.
Yeah, perhaps I can just add to that. First, I wanted to refer to the question of the gang truce in El Salvador, and just like Sandra was mentioning the work of colleagues, I also want to mention the work of our colleague Angelica Dora Martinez, who has been working on comparing, on a comparative basis between Colombia, El Salvador, and Mexico, especially Colombia and Mexico, trying to understand the short-term, long-term consequences of this type of agreements between state actors and criminal actors, and also Jose Miguel Cruz, that has also worked on this, especially in the context of El Salvador. And I think their work and others, what it shows is that, you can, this kind of violent reduction strategies, which are very much short-term and also, again, driven by short-term political goals, have the disadvantage that they do not aim at tackling the social and institutional roots of violence. And therefore, even if they deliver results, these results are very, we can only see them for a very short period of time, no? And they can have consequences that we will see later on, no? So in the case of El Salvador, we know homicides went down for quite some time, but then like extortions didn't, no? And other types of crimes that continue to affect people in their everyday lives and in their sense of security, like were very acute still, no? So these are very, the problem is, I think the question is not necessarily like if a state actor should or not negotiate with criminal organizations, because I think they negotiate all the time, no? And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the history of state building in Mexico very briefly. But the problem is that in the present, those processes are not transparent and not informed by a peace-building approach that, again, tries to really tackle the structural and institutional basis of this current security crisis, no? So because they are so short-sighted, if violence and violence reduction becomes the only aim, it really can backfire, no? And have these detrimental consequences for security, such as, again, extortions and other crimes continue growing, or even worse, no? Like criminal organizations then have incentives to hide this violence, no? Which is the work of Angelica, no? The mass graves that we suddenly see in Mexico is because criminal organizations or groups are given the signal that they should be hiding this violence in order to gain favors from the government. Now, let me just very briefly refer to the fact that I believe that I mean, if we abandon this kind of like macro level analysis, and if we look at how security and violence is negotiated at the local level, no, I mean, at the community level, then we will see that every day criminal actors, or what we call criminal actors, are negotiating not only with the state actors, I mean, with local police, but also with members of the community and with civil society organizations. And these negotiations happen all the time because they are, everybody's interested in seeking some sort of equilibrium, or they are interested in merely surviving. No? I mean, so there is always a back and forth in terms of like what type of violence is allowed or not. No? I mean, and in my work, in my historical work on lynchings, what I found interesting is the police and those perpetrators of lynching sometimes agreed and sometimes disagree on which person deserved to die. No, I mean, so sometimes the police and the quote unquote lynch mob agreed that this criminal deserved to die. So the police participated in the lynching, or they simply stayed put. No, and as in many cases today in Mexico, they didn't do anything, or they didn't intervene in order to save the suspected criminal. In other cases, there were clashes, and so the lynch mob ends up lynching the police that tries to intervene. Or in other cases, the police comes and reprimands those members from the community. So what I claim is that there exists unstable, but there exists a consensus between citizens and state regarding the support for extra-legal forms of violence against suspected criminals. And one could extend this argument to say that criminal organizations, of course, are also supportive of these extra-legal forms of violence.
Thank you, Gema. Sandra. So we have a couple that I think, I know there's another one there, but two that I think can go hand in hand. One relates to violence and prevention programs in Mexico that didn't have the expected impact in reducing crime rates. I believe we can extend this question also to Central America. The other one relates to how do we analyze the links between organized crime and politics in Honduras, where the organized crime took complete control over the state, and where is a civil society in this constellation. So if you want, we can start or we can continue with those two, and then I'll go on to the Brazilian and then the Mexican cases.
Thank you. These are very interesting questions, and I think the crime prevention question brings a lot of reflection on really bad policy making process and lack of understanding of the theory of change, right? Why did they not work? Because they were not crime prevention programs. There has been a large misunderstanding of what crime prevention means and what we can do. And I mean, in Mexico Evalúa, they have a very fine work on why is it that crime prevention programs in Mexico haven't worked. We have been trying to deal with crime through programs on sports, right, dance, and all kind. Like these are things that are not going to have a repercussion if they're not very well grounded, first of all, and if there are no indicators for following up with all the attendees and participants. And then if we're only focusing on primary level crime prevention, which were most of the initiatives that were taking place, these were not about tertiary prevention, thinking about victims and violent actors. So that I think that has been a crucial point on how this hasn't been really working out with the success that we would expect. Of course, there's a major challenge. How do you do crime prevention when there has been so much violence that has been evolving and erupting, right? And we're in a process in which violence has expanded and diversified, as the research agenda by Cecilia has shown, and that it is well beyond homicides, right? And it's well beyond extortion now. So crime prevention is of course something that we should be thinking about in a more grounded way, focusing not thinking only in primary and community crime prevention programs, but thinking from a larger and broader perspective. But at the same time, also being aware of the process in which we're at, and in the way that Gema and Romain have already been referring to, right, in which we have the state being an essential part of how organized crime evolves. and continues to take place. In how Guillermo Trejo and I have referred to it in our recent book, Votes, Drugs, and Violence, is thinking about this gray zone of criminality, which I think goes back to Anna's point before, right, on how this overlap means that these different violent actors can, in different ways, right, be overlapping and be doing the same same kinds of activities, right, and sort of sometimes separate their actions, sometimes actually doing them in very open collusion. But that is why thinking about crime prevention in that regard sometimes becomes it falls short, right, in that sense. However, I think that there is still something to be working on for the crime prevention initiatives that have been going on in Mexico for many years now, which I'm sorry to take it back to the agenda that I was presenting before, which is about how do you build capacities for local communities? How can you build capacities for communities to be more resilient? And that's something that at least we should be working on from that crime prevention perspective. And that doesn't mean workshops, right, on different kind of makeup sports, right? And it's not about that. It's actually how do you build social capital? How do you make people know each other, right? How do you build networks? Networks are crucial here. And that's what we have when we talk about tejido social, we don't know what that means. We just talk about it randomly and we don't really know how to actually make it happen. And that would happen through a grounded crime prevention strategy. But it's a lot more popular, right? And it's literally more resourceful, right? To think about something that tells you about money, participants, right? And something that is enough show off and that will bring off some electoral payoffs. And that's because to build real social capital, it takes time. And even there's another question there in the Q&A button, right? I would say asking about what has changed with about abrazos y no balazos under AMLO. Well, that hasn't been a crime prevention program. It's a social policy program with an electoral, right, background behind, and that cannot help to alleviate crime when crime has evolved to such a level in which the state is part of it, and we continue to think of this at the federal level instead of building capacity at the very local level for both communities and for municipal governments, which I think that's a piece that we continue to dismiss in the policymaking process.
Markus, please.
Yeah, if I just quickly may add, from violence prevention projects in Guatemala, which I studied a bit, like 2010 to 2014, USAID was having a massive violence prevention project of over $50 million. But this coexisted actually with the logics of other agencies of the US having a much more iron fist anti-gang policing, even in the same municipalities. So you would then have more pacification-oriented strategies next to the beautiful sports grounds and schools that Sandra mentioned, which in and of itself is a quite simplistic idea of solving that long-standing and complex crime problems with a 4-year project of modeling public spaces. So I think that was a problem. But also what was unexpected is that you would not come to, as an advisor externally, going to a municipality where everybody's waiting for you to implement a crime prevention project. So there are like very complex demands and clientelistic networks. Even then, like if you talk then to community leaders, for instance, we're like, yes, we want to have a sports ground here, and we don't want to have these gang people here. So you notice that there's like a fight going on, that there's new exclusions and new grievances co-created, which are often unintended consequences. And that's what I meant when I talked about these kind of projects not reflecting sometimes local power structures and ideas that people might have, and not every citizen is waiting for USAID to saving them against the gangs. So that was also a major problem, I think, that we often can see in Guatemala.
Thank you. So I think we have a number of questions that get sort of at this core of what can be done, right? So Sandra, Markus, you already touched on that a little bit. And I think we have an interesting question also asking about, in light of, your analysis, how do we think about international security assistance, think about the bicentennial framework on Garcia. And so, of course, this is not a question that us academics often have good answers for, but the floor is yours to take a stab at how do we what can be done and what has shown to have worked.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can start just by going back to the question of the how prevention has or not worked, and just mention briefly, like there was this study by Vanderbilt University a few years ago already, trying to measure the results of USAID preventive programs in Central America, and actually that study showed that there were very positive results. I mean, in several regards. I mean, and so I think that's a point of reference that is worth mentioning. I think overall the problem is that not only Mexico and Northern Triangle of Central America, but in general in the region, when these type of preventive programs are implemented, there is no established or negotiated criteria beforehand in terms of how are we going to measure success. And oftentimes the measure of success is violence reduction, which when it's measured only in terms of homicides, we have already discussed how problematic that can be, right? I mean, because just focusing on homicides means that then again, criminal organizations may have an incentive to hide this violence, no? Or homicides might go down, but then other crimes might increase. So I think part of the real challenge is something that Sandra was already mentioning, which is that in many of these, like crime prevention programs, or even programs that look at more like the bigger picture of what are the structural or social causes behind criminal violence, the problem is that the process itself should be seen as the end result. What do I mean by this? No, I mean, in many of the programs that have work across the region, and I'm talking, I was working many years ago as a consultant for the United Nations Development Program report on citizen security in Latin America. And what we saw then is that what has worked across the region, I mean, and I'm talking about cases such as Fica Vivo in Brazil, in different periods of time in different countries, are initiatives that bring together communities with civil society actors, with academics, with people from the public sector, and that creates some sort of opportunity to have a public dialogue, no? I mean, and somehow, again, create social capital, no? I mean, but how do you measure that? I mean, and in what time period is that feasible? No, I mean, this is part of the challenge, no? That as I was saying, we're living in a time of punitive populism, no? I mean, so these type of measures and these type of programs, which will deliver results only in the long term, or which measures of results cannot be taken for granted and cannot be measured in the short term, they are not attractive for politicians, unfortunately. Now, what are some of the lessons? I mean, I saw one of the questions was regarding CARSI, the Merida Initiative, and what to do and how to move forward. I mean, the good news is that the Biden administration has at least pledged to drastically change the principles informing Merida Initiative that were in many ways also those that were shared by CARSI. No, I mean, so now in the new relaunched Merida Initiative that I can't remember how it's called right now, but the North American New Security Agreement, offering some sort of assistance to increase the resilience of communities and to tackle the structural and social causes of violence is number one. No, I mean, so instead of having as a number one objective dismantling criminal organizations, is this issue of tackling the social and institutional roots of the problem. So that's promising. No, I mean, how do we do that? It's another conversation. I don't want to keep on talking. The only final point I want to make, I think North America, Mexico, and the United States, and I said that recently in a policy memo with the Wilson Center, is at the very least to adopt a policy of no harm. And what does a no harm approach mean? It means demilitarize or really decrease the presence of the military in security responses. I mean, that is at the minimum what this country should be doing. I mean, in response to migration, coming from Central America and Mexico, but also in response to several forms of criminal violence.
Thank you, Gema. Romain, I don't know if you would like to jump in.
Yeah, thank you. I think Sandra and Gema and Markus just laid the ground for a very fruitful conversation about it and the complexity of what we see in Mexico and Central America. And again, the dialogue between Mexico and Central America, I think, is very rich because it connects, and at the same time, it's really different, honestly. Like what we see in Mexico, and I know that Markus has been writing about it, is basically the way international cooperation, for example, or international agency or international think tanks in general approach violence in Mexico as we were saying during the entire conversation, apolitical actually, and try to actually make it fit into other schemes of violence reduction, peace building, all that violence reduction kind of dogma that is applied in so many other places in the world, right? The other half, I think, or the other end of the spectrum actually sees Mexico and wants to see Mexico as an internal conflict, basically, as a war, right? So you have, I think in that term, like the media, and again, like international think tanks, bringing concepts that come from armed conflict from somewhere else, posing it to Mexico to actually pursue an agenda of seeing it as an internal conflict because it suits international cooperation to see it that way. And then when we come to violence prevention and reduction programs, I think what you were mentioning is extremely interesting. That basically we have a measure for success that is so many times actually designed to suit the donor and absolutely not the situation itself, right? So you can actually do something very good. You can actually measure success in your own terms, but it doesn't really fit what's going on in the ground, right? Because usually I think international cooperation and international funds in those cases that do not really want to invert the money in understanding or just in like basically having time to research and understanding what's going on at the local level, and it takes time, of course, but actually applying measures that are, again, measurable in terms of their own success, right? So you actually build a football field, right? It's very concrete. You see a football field, the mission is a success because you said the success is having a football field, right? So of course, then you can say that it was a success, but you don't know what's going on the football field, for example. And in that sense, I think it's important to actually promote the idea that money, in that case, from international donors, international cooperation, should go to actually understanding and documenting more what's going on the ground, understanding the ties between, as Sandra was saying, civil society and violence at the local level, what's being already done when you get there, basically, what works, what does not work, and where is the state in all this. And then I think what Gema was saying at the end, like first and foremost, probably demilitarize what's going on in Mexico and Central America. Besides the discourses, besides the speeches and all that, what we see is at best a status quo, honestly, right? It's at best the use of the army in that case, or a new, armed police under military command that follows the same exact rules that we see and that we have seen in the past decade in Mexico. It's reactive, basically. You have a crisis that pops up in Zacatecas right now. Nobody was, following Zacatecas 2 years ago. Now Zacatecas is the heart of the crisis in Mexico. You have dozens, hundreds, thousands of dead people for years. No one does anything. Then the violence becomes spectacular. You have 10 people being hanged on a bridge in Zacatecas. The media gets in. It becomes like unbearable for the federal government. The federal government reacts and send like 3,000 troops to the region. And that's the same recipe over and over. So basically, the more we follow a militarized reactive approach, the more we just put like a small cure on something that is much more complex and that we're, I think, yet to address and confront in proper terms. And again, I think the work you have done, Markus, on the way the international cooperation sees violence in the region is extremely important in that sense, and that we should pursue that much more, actually.
Great. So we have about 6 minutes left, and we have one question about the relationship between migration from Central America and the politics or decision-making in the region and in Mexico, considering that migrants are increasingly criminalized and they also transit through areas that have high levels of violence. So if any of you has a short comment on that, and then we'll wrap up the session. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start, since I was mentioning before this question of migration, and as I said before, in the most recent meeting between North American leaders, Mexico, Canada, and the United States, they pledged to foster a new approach towards Central American migration, allegedly based on the question of institution building, institutional capacity, and tackling also the socioeconomic roots of migration. But what I believe it's missing is, again, this can be very effective or could be ideally effective in the medium or long term. But in the short term, like in the immediate term, what we need is, again, a policy of no harm, a vision of no harm that stops criminalizing migrants and that really de-escalates the presence of the military in the borders of these countries, and that creates a safety corridor that protects Central American migrants and Mexican migrants from the harmful and violent effect, not only of criminal actors, but also of state actors. This is, again, a dimension when we see most clearly the politics of violence and crime in Mexico and Central America, because Central American and Mexican migrants are not only being impacted in their security and their integrity by criminal actors, but also with the complicity and with the active participation of members of the military, of the police, and other actors linked to the state in these countries. So that's what I would say, that this is an area where there is definitely a need and a strong need to change. And there is a need also in public opinion in Mexico to really stop. There was like a certain discourse that also from public opinion and from civil society was starting to criminalize Central American migration. Seeing Central American migration as linked to the increasing presence of maras in Mexico, or them providing like foot soldiers for criminal organizations. This needs to stop. This certainly won't help, only feeds into this criminalization of migrants, and really as civil society, as critical academics, we need to change this discourse.
Anyone else? Super quick comment on that? Okay, if not, I'll just thank everyone again for joining us, either in your morning or your afternoon. And of course, a special thanks to our panelists. I have shared again the form where you can sign and support CIDE. This is a tremendously difficult time for Mexican academics, and specifically for academics like Sandra who come from CIDE. So please sign, support, and share widely. And again, thank you everyone for joining. Lots to think about, and certainly we hope to continue this conversation in a different venue. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the OC24 podcast. For more talks, have a look at the podcast feed on whichever platform you use. There are loads more to listen to. Video versions of these talks are also available on the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime YouTube channel. If you would like to share these talks around, we ask that you use the hashtag OC24 and let us know what you think. The 24-hour conference on global organised crime is brought to you by the European Consortium of Political Research Standing Group on Organised Crime, the Centre for Information and Research on Organised Crime, the International Association for the Study of Organised Crime, and the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. For more information, head over to oc24.globalinitiative.net. This has been the OC24 podcast from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. Thanks for listening.